What's up, slackers? Welcome to Book Cheats. For this book, I've got to get suited up. By request of these people, I will be doing The Great Gatsby. Throughout this book, for every chapter, I'll be suited up. In the comments down below, you can vote on what color tie I wear next. Today's featured tie is a purple, blue, and silver stripe by US Polo. Anyway, let's get into the chapter. So like I say on every first chapter, the first chapters are always just a lot of information. They have to introduce the whole setting of the book. They have to introduce all the main characters. And this one, I honestly typed 4 pages up. I won't get into the finite details like I usually do. I'll try to keep it more general. And if you have any specific questions about the chapter, leave a comment down below and I'll get to it as soon as I can. Anyway, at the beginning of this book, we're introduced to the main character. His name is... Alright, let me pause it there for 1 second. Now, I have been working on this video for some time, and I have to admit that I'm a massive fuck up. So for some unexplainable reason, I constantly throughout this chapter and recording said Nick Hathaway. And for those who know the name of the real main character in the book, which is Nick Carraway, every time I say Nick Hathaway, you're going to cringe. And blood is going to spurt out of your ears. I apologize for that. Anyway, back to your featured presentation. Nick Carraway. And Nick Carraway, the narrator of the book, talks about a mantra that he's lived most of his life by. This is something that his father used to tell him, and his mantra is, whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all people haven't had the advantages that you have had. He says this is something that he based his life on for a long time. He said whenever he met someone, he tried not to jump to conclusions, and he wouldn't criticize people. Because of this, he got the nickname of politician in college. Nick Hathaway, the narrator, says that over time, he got tired of caring who people really were and why they did the things they did. He said that he sort of lost interest in people until he met Gatsby. He also hints at the beginning of the book that Gatsby's gone or dead for some reason. Nick Hathaway explains a little bit about who he is. His family own a wholesale hardware store and have owned it for generations. He talks about how he's from the Midwest, and he says that he graduated from college in New Haven in 1915, which was the same place as his father. He also served in the Great War, aka World War I. And after the war, he decided to join all of his friends and get into the bond business. He talked to his father about this, and his father agreed to pay for him to move to New York and finance him for 1 year. Nick Hathaway says that when he moved to the East Coast, he found a friend and they were going to rent a beachfront property for $80 a month. But when it came time to move in, his friend's company moved into Washington, D.C., so he was left alone at a house with himself and a dog and a Finnish lady to do his cooking and cleaning. Nick Carraway says that when he first got to New York, he was feeling really lonely at first, but after a couple days he bought some baking and investment books and got really excited. The narrator describes his neighborhood as one of the strangest neighborhoods in America. He says that his house was pretty much made of cardboard and that his 2 neighbors had mansions. His rent was $80 a month, whereas the houses next to him were around $15,000 to rent. He describes the mansion to his right. He says it was modeled after a hotel from Normandy, Hotel de Ville, and that it had a marble pool and ivory all over it. He says this was Gatsby's house. He had never met Gatsby, but he had heard people talking about him. He also described the islands of New York as a West Egg and an East Egg. Nick Hathaway says that he lives on the West Egg. A little while after getting there, Nick calls one of his distant relatives to have lunch with them. He says that they lived on East Egg. Nick goes over to the East Egg and meets with his distant cousin, Daisy Buchanan, and her husband, Tom Buchanan. He honestly didn't know Daisy really well, and he had gone to college with Tom. He figured he'd make some contacts. He describes Tom Buchanan as being this big football player that comes from an extremely wealthy family. When he drove up to the house, he was impressed with how much money they had and couldn't believe that someone his own age had as much money as they did. Tom invites Nick Carraway in, and 2 women are chatting. Nick looks across the room and looks at one of the women and is immediately enamored with her beauty. The other one was his distant cousin Daisy. Daisy introduces her friend by her last name, Baker. Daisy begins to be super nice and friendly, and is just the nicest person in the world. Daisy talks about how they have a 3-year-old daughter now. Things settle down and Tom asks Nick where he works. Nick tells him that he works for a bond company, and they start to have small talk. As they're talking, Tom passive-aggressively complains about his wife not letting him leave New York. Tom says, "Damned if I live anywhere else." Miss Baker finally speaks up and says, "Absolutely." Miss Baker stands up and says that she's been sitting on the couch too long and that she's feeling really stiff. Daisy gets mad at Miss Baker because she's been trying to get her to go to New York all day. As Daisy and Miss Baker are talking, Nick remembers that he saw Miss Baker in a picture one time. He describes Miss Baker as being slender, small-breasted, with a nice butt, and that he enjoyed staring at her. Miss Baker asks Nick that since he's from West Egg, he must know Gatsby. Before Nick could tell her that Gatsby was his neighbor, Tom came in saying dinner was ready. They headed to dinner and everyone had a nice conversation. As they were having dinner, the conversation suddenly turned racist. Tom started talking about how whites needed to oppress the other races or else they would rise up. Tom says that he's been reading books to talk about how important it was for whites to keep power. He says it's scientific and stuff. Daisy complains that he changed the conversation to something super gloomy, but then she joins in the conversation and says that whites should beat down all the other races. Miss Baker is feeling super uncomfortable and interrupts them with a random question. Tom interrupts her and says that whites have made every modern invention, and as things are getting more and more uncomfortable, the phone rings and ends their conversation. The butler comes and gets Tom, and Tom leaves the room. While Tom and the butler are out of the room, Daisy tells Nick that the butler's nose got jacked up because he smelled too many chemicals when he was a silver polisher. Daisy leans in and says to Nick, "Nick, you remind me of an absolute rose." Nick said that she had a sort of warmth that flowed out of her. She left the room to check with her husband, and it was just Nick and Miss Baker at the table. It was awkward for a moment, so Nick started to talk. As Nick started to talk, Miss Baker shushed him. She got up close to the door and listened in on their conversation. Miss Baker told Nick that Tom was cheating on Daisy with another woman. When Daisy and Tom got back, things were super awkward. To break the awkward silence, Nick commented about how the sunset was so romantic. Tom says to Nick that if there's enough light after dinner, that he'll show him the stables. The phone rang again, and Daisy discreetly shook her head towards Tom, telling him not to show him the stables. This is when things get weird. Nick says that it was so painful at this moment that he wanted to call the police. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker move to the library to chill, and Daisy and Nick head to the porch. Nick breaks the silence by asking her about her daughter. Daisy interrupts him with a complete mood change and says, "Nick, we don't know you very well. Even if you are my cousin, you didn't come to my wedding." Nick tells her that he was still out in the war and that he wasn't able to make it. She gets serious and says that she's had a very bad time and that she's cynical about everything. After a little bit of conversation, she tells Nick that when she had her baby, Tom wasn't there and she didn't know where Tom was. She sat there all alone, feeling completely isolated. She didn't even turn to look at her baby and just asked the nurse if it was a boy or a girl. The nurse told her that it was a girl and she began to cry. The only thing she said to the nurse was that she wished that her daughter would be a beautiful fool. At this moment, Nick felt like he had been tricked the whole time and like the whole evening had just been a play or an act. Nick and Daisy join Tom and Miss Baker inside, and Daisy is reading Tom a magazine. After she's done reading the magazine, she heads off to bed. As she's walking to her room, Daisy jokes that she's gonna get the two of them married. When Miss Baker is in bed, Tom talks about how it's really good for her to be around them, and hints that she might not be 100% white. Nick decides it's time to leave, and as he's starting his car, Daisy stops him and asks about a rumor of him being engaged. He tells her it was a lie and not to believe every rumor she hears. He narrates and says that he was dating a girl seriously, but they were never engaged. As he drove home, he had a feeling of disgust, and he wished Daisy would just run away with her baby, but he knew she wouldn't do that. When he arrived home, he looked towards Gatsby's house and saw a figure in the dark standing looking at the stars. He figured that this guy was Gatsby and he was going to introduce himself, but he got a vibe from Gatsby that he wanted to be left alone, and before Nick could decide what to do, Gatsby had disappeared. And that concludes the chapter. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. You guys have a great day and slack on.
Fingers in your mouth, open up your blouse.